hi everyone. My name is Akash. I'm the CEO of Airtime, which is your fast lane to product validation. Today, I'll be talking to Sam McAfee about how to build successful products. Sam is a Silicon Valley veteran with over 20 years of experience building and scaling products with companies like Adobe. I think he has amazing stories. I'm really looking forward to hearing all your behind the scenes stories, Sam. And we're going to cover unique ways and learn in what unique ways successful products are built. What can we learn from that? And also make an excursion into shipping velocity. Now, without further ado, I think let's get it. Let's kick things off. Sam, it's amazing to have you here, and I want to hand you the mic with a short introduction. Tell us about yourself a little bit.
Sure. Yeah. Thanks for having me. I'm really excited. So I appreciate the opportunity. A little bit about me. I'll try to keep it short. I'm originally from the East Coast. Grew up in Boston, and I am a techie now, but I went to school for social sciences. So I studied political economy. That's the old-fashioned European Enlightenment term before they separated politics and economics. It used to be all one thing, which I think makes a little bit more sense. So I studied how money and power sort of operate and affect societies globally. So I was I moved out to California in the late 90s, 97. So I've been in California for quite some time, 26 years now. And the first couple of years, I was just trying to figure out what I was going to do with my life, right? Like social scientist in California, which I was only dimly aware of the tech scene. But for someone who's interested in how the world works and social change and impact, California was also a pretty hot place to be at that time as well. So I came out and did a lot of weird jobs trying to figure out what I wanted to do. And all of my social contacts, people I made friends with while I was here, coincidentally, they were all involved in the dot-com boom. They were all engineers. Actually, most were engineers. We had one designer friend who we hung out with. And so it became apparent that it was pretty tough to earn a living in San Francisco, even in that time. It's pretty bonkers now, but it was hard then too. And they sort of teased and cajoled me into getting a real job by picking up some web programming, and so I was pretty skeptical at first, but I basically got a couple of books at the bookstore, hacked together a website over the weekend, put my resume on Craigslist, which is still around. Some of you are probably familiar. That's how we got jobs back in those days. And then, the next morning, I had 50 emails in my inbox from recruiters because there was such an insatiable demand for tech labor at the time that I was fortunate. I just got sucked right into that, even barely knowing anything, and I learned on the job. So I had a series of contract opportunities working with different startups in the early. This is around that toy website was 99, the end of 99, basically the holiday break. So right at the beginning of the millennium is when I started. So it's easy for me to count how many years I've been doing this because I started at the beginning of 2000. And so I very quickly realized that I was into technology. I took to programming, like a duck to water, as they say. And so I quickly became basically, what was equivalent to a full stack developer in those days. Learned lots of things, and that gradually morphed into. Eventually, I was able to bring in more consulting technology projects than I myself could do alone, and I started to recruit some of my friends and basically built a team around me, and that launched into eventually running a web development agency for about a decade. So that was a big chunk of my early career. The first 10 to 12 years was going from being a freelancer to basically running a shop. I think at our peak, we had a staff of about 14 people on payroll, building lots of different products for larger companies, smaller companies. I went back to grad school somewhere in there to fill in some of my missing computer science gaps. I'd learned on the job, but then I did go get some schooling to actually learn some of the more fundamental pieces. That was great. And so that was a big chunk, and I think a lot was happening at that time. That we went from the dot-com boom and then the crash, and then a lot of technology trends kind of happened during that period. The rise of mobile, the rise of cloud. There's a lot of changes between that and say about 2012. I had a period in the middle from about 2012 to 2016 where I wanted to be part of product companies. I had been basically a consultant, sort of a mercenary for a long time, and I hadn't really been in the trenches. And so I had an opportunity to be a senior technical leader in a number of different organizations as a full-timer. So I headed up the engineering team at change.org for a while, and they were really growing pretty fast. I worked with a couple of smaller startups as an early stage CTO, VP of engineering in the trenches. And then I also worked with a really great digital agency that spun out of Pivotal Labs called Neo, where I learned a lot of new stuff around how to work with big companies that were trying to innovate. And so I think a lot of my understanding about how to do this stuff properly really comes from the Neo days. We were really heavily involved in the lean startup movement, the lean startup conferences. I would go to those. I was a speaker there, which was at the time pretty separate from the agile movement. I had gotten into agile pretty early on when I learned technology, because a bunch of my friends were reading Extreme Programming by Kent Beck, and they're like, hey, if you're going to learn how to program, you should really learn this stuff. So XP and agile was kind of the way we started doing things. And then there was this lean startup stuff that came out maybe 10 or 12 years later. And there was a while where I was really involved with a group of other people and trying to bring those two communities a little bit closer together so that we could learn from each other. So sponsoring, tracks of one style at the other styles conference so that some of the speakers could come together and share ideas. And so to round out what could totally be a much longer story, about 7 years ago, I went out back on my own and founded my current company, Startup Patterns. And Startup Patterns was originally a book. It is a book. While I was working at Neo, we were encouraged to do a lot of speaking and writing, which is basically where I started doing that. And so a number of my colleagues were working on books. And I thought, okay, well, I've always wanted to write a book. And so that's when I started writing the book. And I called it Startup Patterns because it was all about encapsulating the knowledge of, what are the good things that startup teams do when they're developing new products. And so when I went out on my own, Startup Pattern seemed an obvious sort of name to use as the brand of the company as well. So there's the book, and then we turned it into a company where now we do consulting and coaching and training for mostly growth stage companies that are working on new product development. That's kind of our main thing.
Okay, got it. Thanks a lot. And
I know that was a lot.
oh my God! Like if that's the short version of your resume, like we could do a separate session just going into details. But let's pick one of the topics that I wanted to dig into today, which is shipping products. And I went on Startup Patterns the other day. One of the main points that you have on your website is that. Like one of the signs of maybe dysfunctional is a big word, but one of the signs that something is not working, something is rotten in the state of Denmark, so to say, in the tech team, is that the shipping velocity is low, and shipping a product tends to take longer than anticipated. And as a first thing, based on your experience, what are some typical reasons behind that? Why does this happen?
Yeah. There are a number of reasons that kind of all come together in a theme, which I guess the best way to say it at a high level is complexity. So like complexity weighs down on the team over time, and it builds up slowly and gradually in the background. So if you think about where how teams operate when they're very early stage, startups basically go through phases of maybe you're the founder, you're one person, with an idea, running around, hopefully talking to customers, not always, but we try to encourage people to do that first, trying to get, your idea going. Then you maybe have a co-founder or two, maybe then eventually you bring in a team. And so there's a period where it's still small and everybody knows each other and there's a lot of collaboration and communication. And what actually happens a lot of the time is that the success, the early success can be your own enemy later on. So as you gain market traction and you're making more revenue, you're hiring people, you're adding complexity to your organization, to your team. There's more people. There necessarily needs to be more rigor and more process. In order to scale, you need to separate the things that can continue to change from certain things that now need to be codified and stayed relatively stable for a while. And so that starts to really put a lot of pressure on the team. And I think that now, so what does that have to do with shipping, right? Like, what do we mean by shipping? Shipping really, the velocity, the way that I think about it is pulling a metric from cycle time, or sometimes they use lead time. And the difference between the two is simply if you put in an order for a component to be manufactured at the factory, the lead time includes the amount of time you're waiting for them to start working on your thing. And then the cycle time is the amount of time it takes from when they start to when they finish it and ship it to you, and you, the customer, have the value in your hand. So it's a way of measuring the whole path from a customer request, whether it comes from a customer or it comes from the brains of someone in the company. Oh, we have an idea for a new thing or an idea for a new feature, or there's a bug that needs to be fixed. The amount of time it takes you to get from here's this new information, now we're going to make a change to the product and ship it, get it out in the hands of a customer. So we're mostly talking about digital products here. So, that's like deploying code to a server somewhere so someone can appreciate the change. The amount of time it takes teams to get through that whole process gets longer and longer and longer as companies grow and as there's more complexity. And
is there anything you can do with this complexity?
Absolutely.
Because you can't change the size of the company. You're not going to downsize if you're successful. No. So like the number of people and connection, it multiplies.
Yeah. So there's really, there's a lot of different pieces, but I think the main things that we look at when someone comes and says, hey, our engineering team used to be really fast, we were making customers happy, now it takes forever to get something out the door. The first thing that we'll look at is how much work in process is there? How much is the team trying to do at the same time? So when you look into the lead in science, and you can do this research yourself, you'll find that there's a really tight connection between the amount of work in process, which we shorten to WIP, the amount of WIP in the system, the amount of different tasks that people on the team are working on simultaneously. Whether they're separate or related to the same thing doesn't matter. Just the amount of work that's going on, it affects how fast, what the throughput is of work through the system. So there's sort of like, you can think of it as like a spread. The more things you have going on, the more cognitive load there is to keep track of everything, the more context switching costs there are when you're half working on this thing and you have to jump for a minute to this other thing. So all of that morass in the middle builds up and it puts a drag on the system. So the first thing we tell people is work on as few things as possible at a time together as a team, right? So that's the first part, is overall how much WIP is there, and keep it as low as you possibly can. And we would even recommend that the whole team work on one thing collaboratively at a time, rather than a team of 5 people working on 5 different things. Even that will put a drag on the system. So then that's the other half, which is the human element, is how well are people communicating and collaborating. And so what you actually see in anyone building and shipping a product is that it's not usually one person's job to take it all the way from the beginning to the end. There are different specialties, design, engineering, data science, whatever, where there are handoffs that have to happen. So someone does this part of the product, and then someone else is responsible for doing a different part. And so anytime that those two functions are acting as different departments in a company where, I throw things over the wall and then it's your job to finish them, you create delays, right? So there's queues of work that are half done. Like the designer will design all the pages and then we're waiting for the engineer to build them. That's a classic anti-pattern where all that stuff is just sitting there waiting to get done, and it exponentially slows everything down. So not only do you want smaller WIP, but you also want as tight collaboration as possible. So it's really everyone on the team is trying to ferry this one thing through as much as, as a group, and do all the pieces that need to be done and then ship it and then move on to the next idea. That's really what we want.
Yeah. Following up on your point on the work in progress, I make the hypothesis that it's detrimental for the team's motivation too. That if you have too many WIP and nothing really gets completed, in your experience, how does this materialize? Is it really detrimental? Is it something that you can observe?
Yeah, absolutely. It has a huge impact on morale, and morale has an impact on performance, right? So think about this. So in the United States last week, we had a holiday called Thanksgiving that involves a lot of food, a lot of dishes. I mean, I know a lot of people have harvest festivals. It's sort of a worldwide thing. In our country, that was what we did. And imagine what the kitchen looks like after everybody's finished this big meal. There's giant, piles of pots and pans and plates. And so when you turn around and look at your kitchen, and there's just like this huge volume of stuff that has to be cleaned up. I don't know about the rest of you, but that a little bit saps my motivation. I mean, I'll still get in there and try to scrub, but it's hard, right? Like, so when there's a huge amount of work, it actually has a psychological impact on us, right? Like it can feel really overwhelming. And so that's the same thing that happens in a company when you have a product backlog, or, everything's in process and there's just so much to do. It really drags on people's motivation, and also affects their focus, right? So like a lot of the science that we know around mental focus and performance really has to do with tightening your focus as much as possible is really the way to get stuff done. And so when there's a lot of WIP, it really does drags the team's morale down, because it feels like nothing's ever going to get done. And then it also literally affects the slower velocity, which then reinforces the feeling, because then you're seeing that stuff isn't getting done very quickly. And you have this compounding effect, and everybody's depressed and moving slow. And that's a hard cycle to break out of.
Okay, thanks for sharing. So two major messages here, keep the WIP low, right? And try to have the team works as closely together as possible. So it's not a culture where people throw the ball across the fence or on the other people's half, and then they need to deal with that. Awesome. I have a question, which after I invited you, I had a discussion with my co-founder, and he's my technical co-founder, and I was saying okay, for a certain feature to ship, I'd like to pick this deadline, and I want to go with this deadline. And we had a discussion around how meaningful it is to put a deadline down. And I just wanted to pick your mind and your opinion on what you think about shipping deadlines. What are your thoughts on that?
They're a necessary evil. They're evil, but they are necessary. So I've been a big proponent of the no estimates world for a long time. I think the math is on our side, that spending a lot of time estimating is not a valuable exercise for engineering teams. But I think one of the unfortunate side effects of that, those of us who've been rattling for that for so long, is that the real world where business happens does require things to be done at certain times, right? Like we live in a world that has deadlines, right? So let's not pretend that that's not true. And the way that you approach it, I think, if you're going to be thoughtful about it, if you're a leader organizing work for your team, what you have to recognize is that not all work is the same type. It's not all the same class. So what's come out of the lean science is that there are different classes of work or classes of service. And they can be treated with different rules or protocols for how to handle them. So what am I talking about? I'll give you a concrete example. Most of the work in the backlog is what we would call, FIFO, first in, first out. It's sort of a queue, you put things in and then you finish them in an order. Anything and then presumably they're in some sort of value order. The things in the front are the most important and you work on them. That is one class of work. It's kind of a standard class where things just flow through. But you might have some other classes as well. You might, for example, have an urgent or expedite classification, where there are certain types of work that have to jump the line and get done immediately, right? So we all know that there are expedite things. They come up all the time. What we want to do, and those expedite things interrupt the regular flow of work. And so whatever you had predicted about that flow of work, once an expedite comes, the CEO calls and demands something, or your biggest customer is like, I need this right now. That's going to affect your prediction for the regular work. And then there's yet a third class, which we could consider a fixed date item. Here's an item, such as you were suggesting, we need to, ship this before the Super Bowl ad, when the Super Bowl is coming in January and our ad's going to be on, in front of 1 million people, the URL has to be ready, right? So that's a fixed date where there's a high cost if you miss it, right? So you would treat those items differently, right? So standard stuff, first, the first in, first out, expedite, and fixed date. And there are some others. Those are all different classes. And what we try to do actually is we try to organize our team's capacity to plan for that stuff in advance. So for example, if you have a queue, if you have a backlog of things you're all working on, that's mostly that first in, first out, never plan 100% of your capacity on that stuff. You have to leave space for some of the other classes of work. You have to leave space for the expedite items, even if they haven't come yet. That it's possible they can arrive. That's their nature, right? Like the unexpected will happen. That angry customer will call right when you're not ready for it. So you try to just plan extra capacity for the unknown, and fixed date stuff can also operate in that planned space. So the real lesson, similar to the one we were talking about with work in process, is you never load your team or your system or your organization to 100% capacity. Nobody does that. If you talk to people who know networking science or phone lines or traffic patterns, you don't want your highways loaded to 100%, right? Like what happens if the LA freeway has 100% capacity? Nobody moves, right? Like you're in gridlock.
Yeah.
So in systems where you have heterogeneous movement of items all the time, you always want to keep a little bit of slack in your system so that you can adjust when unexpected items happen. And that creates slack that you can work on the planned fixed date work without impacting the schedule of other stuff that's just flowing through your systems. I don't know.
Yeah.
Hopefully that answers.
Yeah. Absolutely. And I see like a lot of engagement from our audience, like awesome commentaries. It's like babies plan the unplanned. I can second that. I have 2 kids. The younger one, 1.5. It's my life is unplanned all the time. Sam, let's talk a little bit about products, successful products, because you've either built a number of them or contributed to their building and scaling. And what I would like to understand, if there's some common denominators that you picked up that are a characteristic of successful products, something that makes them unique.
Yeah, I think there are some key things that we can pull out, and it's interesting because I would actually flip the unique word around the other way. Okay. So the one thing that you can actually think about for anyone who's familiar with the novel Anna Karenina, at the beginning, there's a statement that all, I'm going to
All
paraphrase it here.
families.
All happy families are pretty much the
This is-
same, and all the unhappy families are, have a
Oh,
million variables.
it's one of the most famous starting
Yeah,
or
it's great.
sentences in
It applies
literature.
to
Amazing.
companies as well and teams.
Yeah.
That what we've seen work tend to actually be a lot of the same things. And when things don't work, they don't work in a million different ways. But really, if you follow a set of common principles, all of the successful companies and all the successful products that I've seen, I think you can point, there's some difference in nuance in exactly how people do this, but there are some basic principles. And I think it's important to sort of start with that. What do we mean by success? Like what a successful product actually looks like is that there is a customer segment, a really well-defined and understood customer segment that has a meaningful and painful problem that they need solved by your product or service, and that you're able to deliver a product or service, a solution to that problem reliably and at scale, right? So like overall, in there's another phrase like in a sizable, reachable market. So like if the market for this segment is you can get access to it and it's big enough that you can scale your company, if all those variables are in place, you tend to see a successful product. And when you don't, when you see companies that are not getting off the ground or they struggle somewhere later, it's because one of those things is now not true. It's either you've got, the customer segment has changed, or they weren't who we thought they were. Something's wrong with how the product delivers the value, or the market has shifted and there's no longer room to scale. There's a lot of different reasons why it breaks down. But what we've seen with successful product companies over and over and over again is that the customer is always at the center of everyone's thinking, right? Like in tech, we're famous for having ideas that are basically our solutions. Like, oh, wouldn't it be cool if? I can't tell you how many times I've talked to a founder for the first time on a call, and they say, I have an idea for an app, right? Like we all have ideas for apps, right? Like I don't care who is it helping. Have you talked to those people? Do you really understand what their problem is? So you have to be relentless about validating your understanding of who your customer segment is, and also really understanding what their problem is at a very deep and empathetic level, right? Before you go and try to build any sort of solution. So coming out of design thinking, a lot of people will be familiar with this concept of the double diamond, right? So imagine sort of going across, and there's two diamonds in the pattern, right? So the first diamond is, these are triangles, right? Like you diverge, as they say. That's when you're exploring lots of ideas. And then the other half of the diamond is you're converging, and the triangle narrows back to a point. And there's two of them. And the reason that's true is because the first diamond is all about validating the problem that you're solving, and the second diamond is about validating the solution. And so one of the biggest places where I see teams trip is they put the solution first. They have a technology and they want to shop it around and try to find a buyer, right? That's absolutely not the way that you want to do it. You want to definitely really explore a particular customer segment and really understand that you've got the right problem and that they're willing to pay to solve that problem. And then you can go into validating the particular solution.
Super interesting, and it's and at the same time, it's intriguing because the idea of validating the problem and the solution with users first, even before you build something, it's been around for a while. It's not just the last few years. No, it's I would have expected that a higher portion of the market picked it up as a standard approach. And from the you must have also worked with teams that put the solution first, and that they built something and they just shopped around, looked who wants to sell it.
All the time.
So my question is, and this is going to be my last question, is did they not know that they should investigate the problem first, or why is it that they still jump to the solution even though it's fairly common accessible wisdom that we should all start with validating the problem?
Yeah, well, there's a long answer that I can't give you, but I would love to talk about it in detail if anybody ever wants to, where we could really unpack the psychology and organizations of where this comes from. But the short answer is essentially we want to believe things that make us happy. It really is that simple. So when you have an idea, when you have a solution, you've built something, you've tweaked something, you've innovated, and it feels very useful. It is extremely easy for us as humans, both individually and in groups, to convince ourselves that we don't need to do the validation because we're absolutely sure that this is great and people are going to love it. It's so easy to do that. And I've seen some of the smartest, most sophisticated people in the product world make that mistake when they don't have colleagues or peers or a coach or somebody to kind of sanity check. I mean, I'd still do it, right? Like I try to make a process out of getting my colleagues, getting my friends to like play devil's advocate when I have some crazy idea, because I know that I'm also at risk. Like I'm sure that everybody's going to love this thing that we've built. Why wouldn't they? Because I'm smart and I've been around and I know people and I'm pretty familiar. So there's a lot of compulsion to skip the validation process, also because we're excited, and also there's a lot of market pressure to get things done, right? So sometimes it's organizational, the board or the leadership, they don't want to sit around waiting for you to validate. They want you to come up with your new idea and ship it to the world and we'll make lots of money. So there's a lot of social pressure to hurry up and build and get things to market and sell them. Unfortunately, it's really a problem when you get there and it's crickets and nobody wants to buy it, because we had the opportunity to check first and we didn't take it. So now we wasted all this money.
Yeah. Okay, that's it has to be a last sentence because I want to give our audience the chance to ask you questions. I'm going to pick up one question from earlier on in the conversation. Mariana asked, what do you recommend for somebody? You know what? I could even put it on the screen here. This is an amazing tool for somebody who's a full stack developer and wants to start a career as a product manager in Silicon Valley. Do you have any recommendations how to get started?
Yeah, I probably can pop off a few ideas, and then please, we can talk about it further. I'm welcome to have people connect with me on LinkedIn, and I talk to people about this sort of thing all the time. So I'm happy to talk about it in more detail. But for now, what I would say is switching from one discipline to another is always gonna be a little bit tricky, right? Because you're always kind of starting over. So that would be true if you were going from sales into marketing, or accounting into operations. So the distance between a full stack engineer and a product manager doesn't feel that far. But in order to get hired as a product manager, fortunately or unfortunately, I don't know, it's kind of a mixed bag. Most people who are hiring product managers want to hire product managers who've already been a product manager. So it's a little bit of a catch-22, right? So it's sort of like, how do you actually get the expertise? So I've actually coached a lot of people who are doing this career change, who are going from engineering into product, or even the other way around. And I will say that it's pretty tricky to just get hired as a product manager. I think you would be much better off if you were in a company working in the discipline that you're already well versed in as a full stack engineer in this case. Could be also true for a designer, for example. If you want to get into product, probably the path of least resistance is to look for opportunities within your company where you can apprentice or basically get involved with the product process in a safe environment where you already work there, and they can create a career path for you to go up into product. It's pretty hard to just sort of jump across laterally, right? Because you need that experience. So there can be ways where you might get involved with a technical project that has a lot of where the product management required is a very engineering heavy, and you can do the product management work from an engineering perspective for that project. So another way to say this is you look for opportunities to do product management work that you can point to later on your resume, or you just start doing the product management work. I also want to point out that there are a lot of excellent resources. So I would read books like, Melissa Perry's Build Trap book. I would read Teresa Torres' Continuous Discovery Habits, and lots of the other great product management literature. Like, really get yourself well versed. There are also courses that you can take on how to become a product manager. I don't lead them, but I know there's lots of great ones out there. So you really do what you can to get the knowledge, and then you try to find places where you can informally apply it in your current working situation and build up that corpus. And then you'll be in a position where you could get a possibly a junior PM role and kind of work your way up once you have some of that experience. And look, like, product management is super hot right now, and there aren't enough of them. So on the one hand, like, demand for product management skills on your side. But there is a little bit of this bias where people want to see some experience first. So you got to just be scrappy and go out and get that experience however you can, and then be able to tell a story in your interviews about how you have already applied product management thinking and why you're a good fit for that role.
Yeah, and maybe like an inspirational add-on, like arguably the most influential product leader, Marty Kagan, started out as a developer, and he transferred in the 90s into a product manager role with the help of a mentor in the company that he worked at. It was a larger company. They could afford that, but I think it's a good example to bear in mind, like where did actually the guy come from who wrote
and so they're familiar with how product ideas sort of fit in the ecosystem of customers and competitors and all that stuff. So learn that. Learn business modeling, learn how to do competitive analysis, learn the business side of the business that you want to be a product manager in. They also have a really strong command of data and statistics. They don't have to be a data scientist, but you really need to understand the basics of collecting data, both the dirty side of instrumentation and making sure that it's clean, and then also how to interpret different charts and analysis and that sort of thing. So spending some time understanding sort of the basics of statistics and funnels and all that stuff, metrics. That's the second piece. The third piece is they have really good, somewhere between like customer empathy and design sense. Like, they have a human-centered design way of thinking. They don't have to be a designer any more than they have to be a data scientist, but they have to be able to they have to have a good eye for design in the context of, is the customer or user going to be able to use this thing? So it's just more like they have to have that in their quiver, or their bag of tools. So we've got business, we've got the data and analytics, we've got some kind of human-centered design, customer empathy sort of stuff. And then the last piece that they really need is they have to be able to be a team player and lead with influence and be able to operate within an organization. So they need that like human management, influencing leadership skill that most people need to be functional in most companies or corporations. Those are valuable skills for everyone. But a product manager particularly, they don't usually have authority over the people that they're working with who actually are building the stuff. And they're not building the stuff, they're facilitating the process, but they're usually accountable to a board or a head of product or something like that. So you got to be able to talk to people, to listen, to negotiate, to tell a story, to have really good human communication skills. So that's like the people organization stuff, the human-centered design stuff, the data and analytics stuff, and the business model and business understanding. If you can build skills in all four of those areas, you will be a very well-rounded product manager. There's probably stuff I'm missing, but those are like the four fundamentals for me.
Amazing. Sam, I'm grateful that you joined us or joined me today. I'm very grateful to the audience which was extremely active, commenting, asking question, discussing whatever you said also amongst themselves. So I appreciate that. With that, I'm going to end our session now. Thanks for everyone who could stay to the very end. And Sam, I hope to see you around in my show and webinar in the future. There's so many more topics that I'd love to unpack.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm also very grateful for the opportunity. This is stuff that's really important to me, and I really I'm delighted that you invited me. It's been a really fun conversation. So thanks so much for having me, and thanks to everyone who participated. And again, like, absolutely reach out to me on LinkedIn. I'm very into talking to people, very friendly online. So I'd love to connect and continue the conversation.
I can second that. We bumped into each other in San Francisco, and I think it took me 5 minutes to invite you to this webinar. So it's very easy to break the ice.
Yeah.
Then on that note, I wish everyone a nice day, morning, evening, depending on where you are, and see you around, and see you in the next Airtime webinars too. Take care, everyone.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.